Welcome to Manifested Publishers. We are handling economics, that is April 2024 paper, question 5. The first question on 5, that is A, explain 5 disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate. Explain 5 disadvantages. Explain, that is 5A, explain 5 disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate. Explain 5 disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate. So the first thing is to understand what we mean by managed floating exchange rate. The first meaning of a managed floating exchange rate, this is where government intervene to manage the difference in exchange rate, and this management of floating or varying exchange rate is basically done by the government through the central bank. Is basically managed by the government through the central bank. And we know that how is it being managed? The government intervened by selling and buying of currency in order to maintain that stability. The government intervened by coming in to buy and selling of currencies to maintain a certain exchange rate, to basically manage a certain is sure exchange rate. So that is what you mean by managed floating exchange rate. So the first disadvantage, you say different government. One you say different government set different exchange rates. So the different government we know basically set different exchange rate. That different government would basically have a different exchange rate, which is inconsistent, with others. So that is the first disadvantage of managed floating exchange rate. That different government will basically set different exchange rate, which is inconsistent with the other. We can talk about the fiscal policy tend to be weaker. Number 2, the fiscal policy. We call it the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy tend to be weaker. And we say that when you talk about fiscal policy, we're basically talking about how the government basically uses taxes and expenditure to manage the economy. So the next reason why, disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate is that the fiscal policy tend to be weaker. Then we can have managed exchange rate can be manipulated. Managed floating exchange rate can be manipulated. We say can be manipulated by the government. They can easily be manipulated by the government. The managed floating exchange rate can easily be manipulated by the government because the government is the one that is basically involved in managing that variation through the central bank, that is by buying and selling currency to basically have what we call a certain range. So lastly, we can talk about countries become involved. We have number 4, or not lastly, countries become involved because it varies for countries. We say that basically countries becomes involved. We basically say that the countries become involved. The countries become involved in rounds of competitive, because each country is trying to bring trying to bring certainty in the exchange rate, a round of competitive devaluation, we say in order to, round of devaluation in order to capture what we call competitive advantage. In order to capture competitive advantage. Devaluation, we know that the value of the currency being lower as compared to other currency in order to capture what we call competitive advantage. But lastly, we can talk about the last five. We can say that whenever we talked about managed floating exchange rate, we know that there is variety, different countries, that is say different countries set different exchange rate, and this leads to variation in the exchange rate. We can see when they set for their competitiveness, it leads to variation in the exchange rate. This would basically lead, because different countries set different exchange rate depending on what they want to come up with, and this leads to the variation in the exchange rate. Those are basically how we manage that particular question. But again, the examiner can be very clear and ask the learners or those that are tested, to talk about now what are the advantages of managed floating. The word is managed floating exchange rate, which is also different from floating exchange rate and the fixed exchange rate. So learners can move ahead and look at the fixed exchange rate. Learners can also look at the floating exchange rate. Remember, this particular question was on the managed floating, not floating exchange rate, but managed floating exchange rate, where we say that the government is basically involved in managing the exchange rate by buying and selling currency to bring the rate of to maintain certain rates in the economy. That is how we particularly handle that question 5, Roman 1. We proceed to the next question, that is question 5b. Outline 5 reasons why high cost of living is a major policy issue in developing country. Outline, that is B, outline 5 reasons why high cost of living is a major policy issue in developing countries. Number one, very important to understand what we imply by high cost of living. When you talk about high cost of living, we're basically talking about amount required to basically cover the basic commodity, that is food, housing, electricity, for a specified period of time. And a number of reasons that will lead to high cost of living, we know that would be corruption and mismanagement. We know that a number of reasons with high interest rate, unstable exchange rate. We also have things like COVID-19. Those will lead to high cost of living. So when you basically talk about high cost of living, we basically understand that the cost of covering basic expenses becomes very high. So why is it a major policy issue? Why should the government basically look into this keenly. Number one, you can talk about it can lead to high external debt. It can lead to high external debt, which again is very detrimental to the developing economy. So one, it leads to high. One, you can say it leads to high external debt problems. High external debt problems. For example, you have to borrow because of the cost of living is high. The country will lead to borrow from other countries in order to cover their expenses. Another thing, when you have high cost of living, we can talk about it leads to social evils. Social evils, such as we can talk about because you require high amount of social evils such as prostitution, and crime. It can lead to high cost of living, social evils such as prostitution and crime. It can lead to prostitution and crime when you have high cost of living. And that is why it is a major policy issue. Again, when you talk about high cost of living, it can lead to massive corruption. It can lead to massive corruption. We can talk about massive. We can talk about massive, what you call massive corruption. Massive corruption. It can basically lead to, it may lead to high corruption and mismanagement of resources. It leads to high corruption and mismanagement of corruption. So when there's high cost of living, because people are trying to get a lot of money, so you find a majority of people who basically be corrupt in order to be able to cover their basic expenses, especially when the cost of living is so high. We can also talk about it can lead to what we call, it can lead to unfavorable balance of payment, unfavorable balance of payment. In this case, we can talk about a deficit. For example, a country may heavily, because the cost of living is very high, a country may heavily depend on import rather than exporting. The country may basically rely on import rather than exporting. So we can say, into bracket, deficit leads to deficit. We can say leads to deficit in the balance of payment, in the balance of payment. And that's why it's a major policy issue, because a country, domestic industries, people will not basically rely on the domestic industry, but others will definitely rely on import. But we talked about high corruption and mismanagement. We've also talked about social evils such as prostitution and crime. Then you can also talk about high external debt, because the cost of living is very high, a country has to borrow a lot in order to cover for the expenses. We can talk about five. High cost of living. It may lead to high dependency ratio. Define, for example, those that are extra very rich, those that have will be there to support those who do not have. They will be there upfront to support those that basically do not have. So that's another reason why it is a major policy issue, why high cost of living is a major policy issue, because it will lead to instances of high dependency ratio, where the people have to depend on others, or they have to depend on government. Government has to borrow a lot in order for the population to survive. We cannot add one and talk about it can lead to, we can talk about it can lead to 6, it can lead to, it can lead to high unemployment levels, high unemployment level. If resources cannot, it requires, there's a high amount to cover basic expenses. Money has no value together. Majority of people will not be having jobs. So we can talk about high unemployment level. It can also basically also lead to high unemployment level in the country. Those are the reasons why high cost of living is a major policy issue in developing countries. And that is how we basically tackle that particular question. We'll pick it on the next question. That is question 5, Roman C. With the help of a diagram, explain the relationship between marginal cost curve and average total cost curve. With the help of a diagram, explain the relationship between the marginal cost curve and the average total cost curve. So we put it down. So say that with 5C, with the help of a diagram, comma, explain the relationship between the marginal cost curve, and the average, what we call the average total cost curve. So first of all, very important, we need to understand average total cost curve, average total cost, and marginal cost. We need to understand that average total cost is total cost over the quantity. When you talk about marginal cost, that is change in total cost over change in Q. So we put the diagram down is when we talk about it. So on the y-axis, that is MC, then ATC, MC and ATC. So we have, this is the ATC, then we have marginal cost. But very important in this diagram to understand, is that marginal cost curve cuts ATC at minimum points. The first thing we need to understand, marginal cost curve cuts ATC, average total cost, at minimum, we say at minimum point. So basically this is a minimum point at a minimum point. That is the first thing that we need to understand from the diagram. The second thing that we really need to understand from the diagram is that MC is less than ATC. MC is less than ATC when ATC is falling. When ATC basically is falling. We need to understand that MC, which is the marginal cost, so we need to put it down. MC is marginal cost. ATC is average, what we call average total cost. We have the average total cost. Down here, we have Q, which is quantity. Down here should be quantity. So again, we're saying that MC, which is the marginal cost, is greater than ATC, ATC is rising, basically when ATC is basically rising. So the marginal cost is basically greater than our average total cost when basically it is rising. And you can see when it's rising, it is basically greater than that. Then you say MC cuts ATC curve. MC cuts ATC curve at minimum. Minimum. And what do we basically imply when you talk about at minimum? At minimum, that basically means at that point, MC, when it cuts there, MC is equals to ATC. That the marginal cost curve is equals to ATC. Marginal cost curve is equals to ATC. Marginal cost curve is equals to ATC. And we need to also understand that at that point, the gradient of ATC at that point is also equals to 0. Gradient, we say that the gradient of ATC, gradient is basically equals to 0. At that very point, we also need to understand that the gradient is basically equals to 0. At that point where it cuts it, MC is equals to ATC, and you know that the gradient of ATC is equals to 0. Gradient of ATC equals to 0 at that point. Gradient of ATC is equals to 0. And that is how we particularly tackle that question. That is question 5C. How we tackle that particular question, question 5C. We pick it on our last question, question 5. It says that outline 5 objectives of minimum wage legislation. So we put it down. Question 5D. Question 5D. Outline 5 objectives of minimum wage legislation. Outline 5 objectives of minimum wage legislation. The first thing to understand is, what do we mean by minimum wage? So this refers to the wage awarded by the government, and you say that that wage, particular wage, is basically above the market rate, to different workers in different sectors of the economy. I have said that minimum wage is a wage that is basically awarded by the government, and a very key to know that it's always above the market rate to different workers in different sectors of the economy. Why should the government, and why does the government basically raise the wage above the market rate? So one of it is to improve the standards of living of the workers. One would be to improve the standard, we say the standard of living of the workers. To improve the standard of living of the workers. That is the first reason why the government basically come up with a minimum wage. Number 2, we say to motivate. We say to motivate the workers. To motivate the workers. We say to motivate the workers. That is number 2, to basically motivate the workers. And number 3, to control against industrial disputes. Number 3, to control against industrial disputes such as strikes. One of the reasons why, over many years, one of the reasons why you find there's a constant conflict between employers and employees, that because of the wages that are basically offered. So the government come up with minimum wage to basically control such disputes such as strike. But you can also talk about to improve efficiency of workers. To improve efficiency, you say efficiency of workers, to improve the efficiency of workers, to make workers work much better than they would have worked when they were paid low wages. One of the biggest motivator we know in terms of performance of the workers is basically lies on the wages. Then again, to control brain drain, we can have to control against the brain drain, what we call the brain drain, to control against the brain drain, where we have workers basically going to work abroad. So you come up with minimum wage to motivate them basically to work within the country. We can also talk about to control against the income inequality by distributing, to control against income inequality, to control against income inequality by distribution, by fair distribution, what we call fair distribution, by fair distribution of the income, by the fair distribution of the income, by fair distribution of income. When workers are basically earning at least a wage that is above the market rate, you're able to control against income inequality, where we have some people having much income and workers, probably the workers at lower level, earning lower wages. So minimum wage legislation will basically control against income inequality in an economy. And that is how we particularly cover that last question in number 5. We see one another in the next session.